that, we can take questions. Yes?
I have a few questions, but my name is Dan Osborne, and I've promoted liberty in a number of organizations throughout the world. And something I've found, and I was wondering your comments on this, is that only certain personality types seem to be predisposed to liberty. And I've found that if I spend my time on certain personalities, there's no output to it. I was wondering if you could comment on personality and liberty.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of any given individual's results, I mean, my view on this issue in general is there are definitely better targets and worse targets across many axes. So I was focused on one axis, which is just kind of, what is your position? Like, are you an industry or are you an intellectual? But there's certainly certain personality types are more predisposed. But I think in general, it's very hard to find someone for whom you can't move the needle at all. And my basic rule is that if I have not moved someone in my direction, it's my fail. Like, I try to learn. I mean, I try to learn from, you can always do better in everything, but in particular, if it really doesn't go well, it has to be something different. Because at the very least, the way you conduct yourself in interaction, if you conduct yourself respectfully and are not defensive, they have to think more highly of your position. You know, they sort of have to think of you and your position in the same way. That said, in terms of, it's a good question, and I honestly haven't really broken it down in terms of, I do it on a very like emotional perception basis in terms of how I talk to a person and I feel them out, and there's a couple things I feel them out for. I mean, I definitely feel out, like, are they interested in ideas? Like, are they honestly interested in ideas? And I can sniff pretty quickly if someone is interested in ideas as a hobby, you know, to show off, to like feel good about themselves, and that is immediately repelling to me. Let's see what else. There's the interest in ideas. Definitely don't want, I mean, you want openness and honesty, and so the orientation of not being defensive, really being interested in the truth, and not being threatened by the idea that something that they believe currently is incorrect. That's a big one. And then there's a certain, and this is what I perceive more emotionally, there's a certain just vitality. So if the person has no enthusiasm at all for ideas, even if they say, like, Alex, I love what you're saying, but they just like, Alex, I love what you're saying. It's great. My personal interest in them as a friend, but also as a member of a movement, is very compromised, because you have to be, in advocating things, you have to be congruent. You can't say, especially if you're talking about any kind of philosophy of life, or you're saying this is the right political system for people to live under, and if I myself come across as a weirdo, they can't, it's completely incongruent to say, hey, I'm going to tell you guys all how to set up the perfect political society, because the implied thing is, well, but if the perfect political society is one that you think is perfect and you're the way you are, why would I want that? People don't think about this, but it's a very legitimate reaction. Whenever anyone is selling you a philosophy, they should be judging. If I'm selling you any kind of philosophy, they should be judging me, absolutely. Like, is this the kind of person I want to be? Not exactly like me, but if I repel them, they have every right to be turned off. Now, they should still think about the ideas, but at least they should think the way this person deals with the ideas, this speaker, is not for me. And by the same token, when I talk to people, if there's just something off, and they're really just, there's no vitality in them, that lessens my interest. Now, I hope no one is intimidated in talking to me later that I'm going to be judging their vitality. Yes?
Did you always believe these things? Did you always have a sense that this is the right way to think about public policy?
Were you here at the beginning?
Yes.
So I just want to be clear, which ways? Like my free market beliefs, philosophical beliefs, or?
All of it, yeah. Or did you come to it somehow?
Well, I mean, you have to come to it. You don't get, it's not like Plato where it's in your head and you grew up with it, or you had it from a previous life. But, I mean, certainly, I guess the main thing I always had, which is, I mean, I definitely always loved the idea of business. I always loved the idea of being successful, and that was one driving thing. And the second thing was when I was about 14, going on 15, I decided, basically, I've been in math and science all my life, but it really frustrates me that people are always arguing about politics. There must be a logical way to figure out all this stuff, so I'm going to do it. And I didn't realize how big a thing that was, but I had this conviction that everything is, to use a non-term, figurable, outable. Right? And so that's really, those two things have animated me, and so I really like solving the puzzles and thinking of things. And then I've always liked business. That's why I wrote about business for a while. But what I like about running my own thing is I get to actually run a business based on convincing people of ideas that I figured out. So I like the figuring out of the ideas, and then I like the figuring out of how to run the business, and then the figuring out of the principles of how to convince people. But it's, so that those are stages, and it's like I wish I had realized certain things earlier, but I'm almost glad that it came this way, because you really need to be obsessed for a while if you're in a field about just the truth, and just non-stop be thinking about like what is right, challenging yourself, talking to everyone in the universe, getting the smartest people you can to oppose you, to shape your views, to edit you. And I still do that to some extent, but I have to do all these other things. So it's good to be, if you're going to be like an intellectual entrepreneur, it's good to be in a phase where you're spending almost all your time just being an intellectual, because otherwise what happens is people get really sloppy. Like they'll run an organization and they'll speak up about issues, but they just don't know, they don't know too much, so they're a figurehead, and there's certain pitfalls to that. Yes?
You made a statement earlier about when dealing with politicians, not to just give them ideas, but to give them solutions or
Yes.
But the problem, it seems to me, is that especially when looking at public policy from a pro-liberty perspective, is that there's this deluge of regulations and legislations constantly being passed, and a lot of it limits our freedom.
Yeah.
So, take for example, the Canadian government's looking at an internet spying bill that will allow the government to spy on the internet users from the country. Well, you could go to the politician and say, well, you could do this and this to make it a little better, but in reality, it would be best if that bill didn't exist in the first place. So, what would you do in that case where it's always, just don't do these things?
Yeah, so this connects to the issue of both the solution, but also the issue of the positive. So as I indicated, we're Center for Industrial Progress. So even though our policies, in a sense, amount to don't do anything, it shouldn't really even be thought of that, because having a good law is an achievement, and that's something exciting. So when the founding fathers created a good set of laws, I mean the best set of laws ever created, it wasn't they're doing nothing. And it's not even just, oh, they're getting their grubby hands off the people. Because it's not, they're creating a government of proper laws, or the best approximation that have ever been created. And by the same token, we're enthusiastic about how property rights, say, protect the right to develop industrially on your own property, and also the right to be free of pollution from others on your own property. And that can include your water, your air, your land. That's an exciting thing, and that should be viewed as forward-looking and progressive, and we're industrial progressive, as my friend calls it. But it should be viewed as forward-looking to have a pro-freedom law, not just the problem that happens is in being reactive, in that they just propose a bunch of bad stuff, and we just say no, 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 versus saying, and what often happens is the other side. They have what's called a moral narrative, which is basically a story about like this basic choice that we face as a society, where if we don't do these regulations, it's going to be really bad and reflect really badly on us. I'm sorry, if we do them, it's going to be, if we do the regulations, it's going to be really good and reflect well on us, like say post-financial crisis in the US. And if we don't, it's going to reflect badly on us. So what you need to do is always have an alternative narrative with a positive ideal, which includes a policy solution and then a clear idea of what way of life is that for. So an example I like to use is in the housing market in the US. there was all this government intervention in the name of the American dream. You know, the American dream is homeownership, and that was a very powerful moral narrative. But what needed to be changed is that not just saying no, that we shouldn't have Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and FHA, et cetera, et cetera. It's that having an alternate, true vision of the American dream, which is where you take responsibility for your own life. And it's not about what kind of structure you live in, whether you live in a house or an apartment. That's completely non-essential. It's whether you get to take responsibility for your life and live life on your own terms, or doing that versus being in a mountain of debt, just because you wanted to live in a house subsidized by you, and that you're taking subsidized by other people that you're taking very high risk on. So there's better ways to formulate that. The point is that you need a positive ideal, and then that, both a political ideal and then a moral ideal that the political ideal is serving. And that will help you then reframe the narrative from one that goes against you to one that goes for you. But there always needs to be an element of being aspirational. Like there's something positive to be gained here. And when you do that, the flip side is when you can show there's something really positive to be gained, the negatives then can become really strong. So I'm very for criticizing things, but only if you're very clear on what is the positive value that's being destroyed. Otherwise, it becomes this very, after a while it becomes almost this lifeless no. It's just like, oh God, here the government's doing another thing. They're and you start making fun of them and calling them hypocrites, and it doesn't work. You need to be for something positive and view it as amazing, and then it's horrible that they're doing exactly the wrong thing. Oh, in the back?
Excuse me, I have a cold. I just wanted to ask you, Alex, if you had any specific comments or ideas or suggestions around how to approach people in an industry where it's completely normally controlled and you want to, like, for instance, I work in healthcare, I'm a nurse, but, I mean, and I'm an advocate for liberty, and I do what I can. I talk to my colleagues, and I send letters to the CEO. But I mean, I feel like it's completely like a complete uphill battle. Sometimes it just seems hopeless. But I mean, I'm taking a lot away from this talk. But if you have any ideas of how to approach that,
yeah, let me talk about, because I mentioned the issue of what you as an individual can do. So let me say a couple things about that. In general, unfortunately, I'm not going to have the best answer for you in healthcare because I don't think it does healthcare correctly, and we're not the Center for Healthcare Progress. Yeah, but this actually, part of the reason I'm doing this is to motivate other people to do the same in other fields, because all the principles will be the same. And I even tried to encourage one or two people to do it, although I haven't gotten much success yet in that. Two things that are super successful, super valuable that you can do as an individual, depending on what's out there. One of them is not free and one is free. So everyone likes free, so let's go with free first. What's amazingly underrated is handing out the right literature, spreading the right literature. I'm just astonished by how much people get in arguments on the internet. Now, if you want to hone your skills, fine. I mean, I certainly honed my skills somewhat on the internet. But people will just get in arguments and debates about all these issues as if no one who's an expert or an expert communicator has ever written on these issues. Like they'll write about peak oil or something, which is a controversy in industry and environment, and they'll just kind of write their own summary of what's good about peak oil. Or they won't do it at all because they'll know, well, I can't write a very good version. But there's lots and lots of good stuff out there to pass out. Now, I should say, I don't think the stuff out there to pass out is nearly good enough in terms of being really designed for optimum retention. So one concept that I use a lot these days is called the go-to resource, which is basically a single issue type thing, where if I want someone to think the right way about global warming, it's not out yet, but when it is, it'll be called the Industrial Encyclopedia tentatively, and you'll just go, you have a friend who says something about global warming, instead of thinking of an argument or whatever, you can either go there and learn yourself, or you can just send him a link and say, hey, look, this is it, and then it'll be like Wikipedia, but a much different format, much more an argument format from our perspective, and then you can see like all these things linked to it. So for instance, science by consensus, greenhouse effect, all these different things, so that you yourself don't have to be this autodidact in any field that you care about. And a lot of the way things are written today, in my view, is not very good for consumption and retention. A lot of the way things are written, I think, comes out of the novel, and it's like long essays that are kind of hard to retain. So my favorite formats are basically single issue thing, and often that, and another way of thinking of that is question and answer. So question and answer is a very effective way to learn. I mean, it's why people love Q&A periods. You like Q&A periods more than speeches generally. But also the best way to learn is when you have one exact question and someone just nails that answer, because it fills in your brain exactly where you need it. And then you have another question, then you have another answer. So Industrial Encyclopedia, even though it's not explicitly an FAQ, it has it's basically the equivalent of FAQ. With each issue, it raises a question and then it answers that, and that's really good. The other thing that's really good and underrated is storytelling. Human beings learn in terms of stories. A huge amount of our knowledge and memory is in terms of stories. This is why story is the unit, the conceptual unit that's used, by primitive cultures, modern cultures. It's such an effective way of retaining a certain kind of moral point, or a certain kind of point about cause and effect. So, again, this is in the early stages, but we're very focused on telling stories about industry that have lessons, but that are very easy to retain and powerful and concrete because they're stories. And so in healthcare, what you really, really need is you need stories from the history of healthcare about how amazingly good it was before the government got involved in terms of innovation. Just like we have, I have the story of the early, I have an article called Energy at the Speed of Thought, the original alternative energy market. And that article is the story of how, before the government got involved and there was just property rights, we had amazing innovation and competition. And my first book, which I'm working on now, is called The Story of Energy. And it has a lot of really good lessons, but my conclusion was the best way to teach the fundamental lessons about energy is not to just say, here are the lessons about energy, but for them to have the meat that then justifies those lessons. So in terms of what you want to use in terms of resources, I would think along those two parameters. And anyone who's interested in our issues, you can follow us and you can give us money, and that helps a lot. But you can at least use those parameters because there's a lot of good stuff out there. And over time, even in our field, we'll be collecting the best of what we can from other people. But unfortunately, there's way too much that's either just essay or lots and lots of dry statistics, and it doesn't really fill people's minds in the right way. So you can either pass out, the free way is to pass out resources that always exist, that already exist, or buy copies of Atlas Shrugged is a really good one. It's not the only thing that needs to be done, but it's a really good one. Where you can pay people to create new resources. Yes?
Piggybacking off of the penultimate question, would you say that we need to be targeting natural rights more as a rhetorical technique?
Natural rights? What do you mean targeting?
Well, I know that there have been a number of classical liberals, including Rand, who have made the argument that the decline of classical liberalism was due to a change in the rhetoric so that we were making more utilitarian-based arguments as opposed to natural rights-based arguments.
Uh-huh.
And I was wondering if you thought that we need to start speaking with more of the natural rights rhetoric.
Yeah, neither she nor I uses the term natural rights for various reasons. Well, it's not the worst term, but I think the key issue is certainly, yes, there needs to be more of a rights-based focus, but the way I've seen that done normally is very ham-fisted and ineffective. So if you can't just say, like, people have rights, this violates rights, therefore this is bad. Because that presupposes that they understand and really value and care about rights. The point is, whenever you're presenting an issue, this is a tricky point in communication, but if you're coming from the perspective of rights, your presentation has to include something about why rights are so valuable. So when I talk about property rights in energy production. Part of it is about how this unleashes human ingenuity, how it allows you, to do what you want with your own earned property, how it protects other individuals from pollution. So there's a whole moral character imbued throughout the discussion, and rights themselves are a moral concept. They're saying this is the right way for people to be free to act in a society. So a lot of, one term I use a lot is aspirational advocacy. So you have to be, in any communication, it has to be connecting to the individual's values, and certainly that includes rights. So rights is a big content focus, but in terms of method, it needs to be very much connected to individual human lives. And if you want an example of an organization that does this in many ways, the Institute for Justice is probably the best, in terms of the large think tanks, the best at this, because they take legal issues of individual rights, but they're always connecting it to, this is why this matters to an individual's life. This is why this matters to your life. It's not just, these guys have rights, they're being violated. And epistemologically, you could say the point is, nothing in this sphere is self-evident. So you always have to include its tie to people's life, because that's really the ultimate thing that's convincing to people, and legitimately so. So if there's no emotion to, and this might sound weird to some people, but if there's no emotion to a presentation, I would say it's wrong. Yes?
I was just thinking, one thing I find hard to overcome is the need for compromise. And where I'm going with this, I'm thinking of a case, you probably read about it, a lot of people have probably seen a YouTube video on it, read about it, of a woman in San Francisco who tried to open an ice cream parlor. And because of all the municipal regulations, it took her something like close to 2 years or 18 months to battle and battle and battle just to open a business in this premises that she had leased. And I think most people who see that case realize that that was ridiculous. That was just way too extreme. But at the same time, they feel, well, regulations shouldn't be that extreme, but there should be this or this or this. And that compromise is what really leads to the extremities. So when I have engaged people in these discussions, I always find that everybody feels that if you compromise, that's the solution, and I disagree with that. Firstly, do you disagree with that? And secondly, how do you overcome somebody's desire to come to compromise rather than finding a real rights-based individual, an individual rights-respecting solution rather than a compromise?
Well, let me tell you how I think I would deal with her situation, and then you can ask. I want you to follow up about compromise, because compromise is a term that is used very fluidly, and there are many legitimate forms of compromise. I negotiate speaking fees with people, so I compromise all the time. There's an issue of compromising on a moral principle, but then there's an issue of compromising when a gun is to your head, which is not a moral compromise, but is you're acquiescing to force. I think though what's interesting about this situation is it's often presented as one side is saying there should be no regulation, and the other side is saying, oh well, we need regulation and they have some purpose, like to prevent. It's usually bogus, but to prevent fraud or whatever.
Yeah, it's usually always about protecting consumers.
Exactly, but notice they've got a moral narrative on their side. It's like, well, left unrestricted, greed will lead to the exploitation of consumers, and then usually the free market side will say, at most, no, it's not. Like, no, it won't. And this is the flaw that of the response to wrong moral narratives. People what they'll do is they'll either appease it, so they say, yeah, it's true, I guess I agree with your policy. They'll oppose some detail but concede the principle, concede the ideal. So they'll say, yeah, it's true, human nature is this way, and people are going to act this way, but let's propose a slightly different, less onerous, right? So that kind of compromise, right? Or they'll just say, no, this is bad, this shouldn't exist. But that's not enough, because then you're doing what I call you're just getting to zero. You're just basically, they're setting the terms, they keep coming up with regulations, and they can come up with many as you can handle, and you just keep responding, and the best you can imagine is that 1 out of 1 billion will get rejected. But I don't play those games. That's a bad game. But a good game is talking about the virtue of the freedom to start your own business, or the virtue of the freedom to engage in, I like to call, business at the speed of thought, or some positive ideal. And you have women like this, or men like this, as an example, where it's, look, this person has a great idea. She wants to act on it now. Isn't that the American dream, that you can have an idea and then you can act on it? Instead of you can have an idea and then a bureaucrat can decide 18 months, whether your desk is positioned properly to the door. Is that America? And so what you do is you make them compromise with you, which is different. So you set the ideal and then they compromise. And it doesn't always mean you'll get the exact right policy at the beginning. But if you're crusading with the ideal, and that's the key thing, and you say, yeah, this is the right policy, but you need to keep moving in my direction, like no matter what. So you make the other side compromise with you, and our blog, which is pretty young, but it's called Industrial Progress Report. One of our big goals is we already do, we have people from industry write, some of them coming out in the next couple weeks, writing about their experiences, both positively when they're free and then negatively when they're not. And the goal is to have it as an ideal. Look at what happens, look at the amazing things that happen when people are free, and look at how un-American this is that these people and ideas were telling those stories. And mostly people don't tell those stories because they don't think people will care. But Atlas Shrugged completely refuted that, because Atlas Shrugged gets you to care almost in ways that bring people to tears about businessmen, and it gets you to hate government. The government in that book. And even the people who end up hating Atlas Shrugged, when they're reading it, it's really hard for most of them to not like the heroes and to not sympathize with them. And the point is, when you really tie someone, when you really show that he's good and that his individual life matters, and you relate it to the person and show he's a person just like you, people have to care. They don't even really have much of a choice in the matter. But unfortunately, in our culture, businessmen are treated as inhuman in many ways, but there's nothing inevitable about that. I mean, if you humanize them, people will treat them like human beings. If we let the other side just dehumanize them and refuse to humanize them and don't make that a priority, then they'll just be dehumanized.
Right. That's a good point. I was using compromise, by the way, in kind of a way of diluting a moral principle, as opposed to your example is great. If you negotiate a speaking fee, that's a form of compromise. Although the difference to me is, if we negotiate a speaking fee, we each arrive on something that we both agree is works for us, so to speak. It's a win-win scenario. I hate to call that compromise, because I think a compromise is... Well,
but the thing is, I don't know the etymology exactly, but I mean, compromise is a very helpful term, because you often, just think about the very nature of supply and demand in economics. I mean, everyone wants more for their product than they get, right? And everyone wants to pay less than they paid.
Right.
It's just about.
Yeah.
So you're always compromising in that sense. But the point is, it's only with it's you still both win. You get a good deal. The problem is that this idea of adjusting competing claims and making concessions is improperly applied to the realm of morality. And the morality is supposed to tell you what's actually in your interest in a universal way. So you might have the wrong morality, and then you might have to compromise it. But if you have the right morality, if you thought it through, the last thing you want to do is compromise it.
Right.
Now, you need to think a lot about how it applies to different circumstances, which takes a lot of thought. But if you're really sure this is what's best for me, the last thing you want to do is go against that, because then that's just a self-inflicted wound.
What do you have to say about the problem of basically not compromise with enemies, but compromise with people who are trying to be your allies, and how people who have similar ideas or don't exactly have similar ideas, when it's okay to work with them, when it's not? How do you know objectivists are often really divisive, and sometimes not enough, sometimes too much, and like it's just where do you draw the line? How do you tell what is a disagreement on a technicality or something narrow versus a fundamental?
I got the question. I mean, this is not a new issue. This is a cop-out in a sense, but I am going to answer. But I gave a really good answer to this question in a video that's going to come out soon. There's this controversy among objectivists about libertarians, and I gave the best answer at least I've ever given. I'll just leave it at that on that subject. But let me address it more broadly here. So it's important to think of it as, you have to think about, so let's connect it to the theme of the talk. You have to be results-oriented with everything. So if you have a principle, it has to be a results-oriented principle. When you're making decisions, you want to get results with your decisions. So people tend to think who adopt philosophies or have philosophies often think of like, my philosophy is it's kind of a straitjacket. There's these things I really like to do, and it seems like it'd be good for me, but the philosophy just isn't allowing me to quite do those things. And I don't feel that way at all, and I don't think you should if you hold ideas.
Yeah, that's religion, not philosophy.
Yeah, exactly, but it's understandable in some cases. So the issue of alliances is, this is something Ayn Rand was very interested in. What alliances are actually in your best interest? And now there are many, many axes of life in which you can ally, right? I mean, you can help coach your kid's soccer team, and then certain characteristics matter a lot, and certain don't. You can friend somebody on Facebook, which seems to be a very controversial activity these days in some circles. That's a certain amount of, you can accept someone as a fan on your Facebook. There are many, many things. The core thing I think here, though, is in spreading ideas, is in whom do you ally with in spreading ideas. And the real thing to look at with any given alliance is this alliance really going to further my ideas and liberty? So let's say you really care about liberty, or really think you care about liberty, and you hire someone to write some newsletters, and there's a bunch of racist content in it. So is that a good alliance? Well, some people might say, well, big tent, different strokes for different folks. Well, but no. But obviously, this is a completely disreputable position. I mean, I wouldn't say obviously in the sense of obvious to modern man. It took human beings a long time to realize that racism was bad. But certainly any modern person should realize this. And you certainly don't want to be associated with it in many, many ways. And it's going to be detrimental to you. So there's obviously certain sorts of disagreements that are deal breakers. And in terms of, there are a bunch of, you can work through different examples. But then there are other sorts of disagreements that are not essential to the purpose that you're allying on. So the key question is, what purpose are you allying on? And is this alliance going to serve your purpose or not? So, with the racists, with many other types of people, it's not going to. And in my own view, there's among the liberty, group, there's a whole issue of anarchism, and certainly no one in Center for Industrial Progress, will promote anarchism on the website. In my view, it's a disreputable position. We could go into why that is, but that's not what this talk is about. But I regard that as fundamentally detrimental both to the liberty movement and to my own position and to my own standing. So I believe that I will be viewed properly in a very negative light because of that. So there are many sort of controversies like that, but I'm thinking of it very, very selfishly. It's not someone told me, oh, you're not it's not, for instance, somebody didn't tell me, oh, you're never allowed to ally with libertarians, which I think is a very sloppy phrase, because the term libertarian at this point in history, it used to have some meaning. At this point in history, it just means anyone who thinks they like liberty. But that means there are lots of people who don't know anything, who are just going to call themselves libertarian, who are good people who don't know that, oh, some people are libertarian, who call themselves libertarian or anarchist. But why would I turn away that kind of person? It doesn't make any sense. So you have to be careful when you formulate a general policy about ally with this, ally with that. You have to be very precise. Otherwise, you can turn away good people. So I've seen good people who call themselves libertarians, which is a term I don't like for myself or use, but in just very, very stupid ways, because they think Ayn Rand said, never ally with anyone who calls himself a libertarian, which she never said. There was a movement during her time, the libertarian movement as it existed, and she refused to ally with that movement, but it's changed dramatically, and it's expanded dramatically in what it encompasses. So it's just really, it's all about, what is your purpose, and what are you going to gain And the two mistakes to make are, I don't know what exactly to call it, but is to be dogmatic and have some generality about a specific category of alliances that doesn't, that actually is hurting your interest. And the other one is just to say, oh, I'll ally with anyone who likes what we're doing, like that's good. And that it's not good in ideas, and it's not good in methodology. So for instance, on our website, I always have to think about, even if someone writes a good article, let's say it's true, but the whole orientation is completely negative. Like, there are reasons why I don't want that on our website, because it's not keeping it with the philosophy of the organization. But I might want to have a beer with that guy, so it's all about the purpose and the context. And it's something to think about very well, because it has a huge impact. With the right allies, you can take over the world. With the wrong allies, you can, be a loser.
Any other questions?
All right, well, thank you so much for coming, everyone.